Tonight, my sleepy friends, we're journeying back to the early 1900s to rediscover the remarkable life and pioneering legacy of Janet Bragg, the fearless aviator who broke through both racial and gender barriers as the first African-American woman to earn a commercial pilot's license in the United States. Her strength and perseverance didn't just challenge societal norms, they became a guiding light for generations who dared to dream beyond limits. Before we settle in, take a quick moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Tonight felt like the perfect moment to tell Janet's story. So lower the lights, wrap up in something cozy, and get ready for a story that just might stay with you long after you fall asleep. It all began in 1907, on a warm spring day, when Janet Waterford was born into a world that hadn't yet imagined her potential. While the Wright brothers were still testing the edges of powered flight, aviation was something reserved for daredevils and daydreamers. Janet entered this world. In Griffin, Georgia, born to parents who had lived through the final years of Reconstruction, Black Americans at that time were still struggling for the most basic dignity and rights, let alone the ability to soar through the clouds. Most stories about Janet jump right into her accomplishments as a nurse or pilot. But what really shaped the woman who would later challenge America's aviation boundaries? The roots of her character trace back to her childhood home, a space filled with quiet intellectualism and practical ambition. Her father, an architect and builder, didn't just value education. He passed on a deep understanding of structure, design, and balance, all of which would eventually play into Janet's success in aviation. Her mother, a skilled seamstress, wasn't just someone who made clothes, she brought garments to life. Her hands, swift and precise, transformed fabric into art. From her, Janet learned that excellence comes from detail, that something ordinary can become remarkable with the right touch. In their home, Janet saw that buildings could rise and fabric could flow, not from magic, but from skill and knowledge. When the Waterfords moved to Chicago during Janet's youth, they joined thousands of black families migrating north during the Great Migration. But unlike many others who were escaping hardship, the Waterfords came with some privilege and purpose. This distinction, rarely highlighted in Janet's biography, was essential. She didn't arrive in Chicago desperate. She came ready, supported, and positioned to seize the educational opportunities the city offered. At Wendell Phillips High School, Janet didn't necessarily excel in grades, but she stood out for her curiosity. While most girls her age were guided toward domestic skills or teaching, Janet felt drawn to mechanical drawing classes, usually filled with boys. She didn't just observe, she questioned. She connected the diagrams and engines back to what she'd learned from her father. This wasn't about rebellion, it was about vision. After graduating, Janet made a practical move for a young black woman at the time. She entered nursing school. But even this decision reflected strategy more than convention. Nursing was one of the few respected, stable career options open to black women. And Janet chose the best. She enrolled at Provident Hospital School of Nursing, an institution founded by the renowned Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, one of the first surgeons to successfully operate on the human heart. Provident represented progress within the bounds of limitation, an idea that would later define Janet's aviation path. One often overlooked fact about Janet's nursing career is her choice to specialize in public health rather than working inside hospitals. This placed her at the intersection of science, communication, and community work. She had to translate complex health information, manage bureaucracies, and earn trust. These skills, quiet, behind the scenes, became crucial later when she confronted the aviation industry's entrenched exclusion. By 1929, the year the stock market crash plunged America into the Great Depression, Janet had already built herself into a respected public health nurse with solid income, something most Americans couldn't say. That financial security gave her something few had during that time: freedom. While the nation was fighting to survive, Janet saw a billboard on a trolley ride through Chicago. It advertised flying lessons. Popular retellings often paint this moment as impulsive inspiration. But it's more likely that Janet, who'd long shown interest in mechanics, saw this as an opportunity she had been waiting for. When she enrolled at Aeronautical University in Chicago, she wasn't chasing a whim, she was investing in a future. In 1929, aviation was the frontier of possibility, the way artificial intelligence or space travel might seem today. Janet understood that mastering flight could unlock possibilities that went far beyond the limits society imposed on women and Black Americans. Janet Bragg's story isn't just about ambition. It's about navigating a system built to keep people like her out, and doing so with a combination of brilliance, patience, and psychological strength. Long before she ever touched the controls of an aircraft, Janet had trained herself for rejection, and she had trained herself to persevere. When Janet Waterford Bragg began her studies at the Aeronautical University in Chicago, she was stepping into a world not just dominated by white men, it was designed for them. The early 1930s aviation industry didn't merely reflect segregation, it reinforced it with structural, cultural, and institutional barriers. Aviation was imagined around the physical expectations and social networks of men. Yet Janet's approach to this exclusionary environment was quietly revolutionary. Instead of confronting the discrimination directly, Janet adopted what might be called strategic assimilation. She arrived at class impeccably dressed in professional attire, commanding respect without challenging authority outright. She wasn't there to play a part. She was there to master the field. Her archived notebooks are filled with detailed diagrams, annotated engine schematics, and aerodynamic calculations. They reveal a mind determined not only to meet standards, but to deeply understand the machinery of flight. The culture at the Aeronautical University was mixed. Some instructors questioned her right to be there. Others watched with mild amusement, expecting her to fade away. What none of them expected was Janet's quiet, relentless progress. She stayed after class. She reviewed her materials multiple times each evening. She treated aviation not as a hobby, but as an intellectual pursuit. Most accounts of her journey overlook the emotional labor that came with being the only Black woman in these rooms. According to her journals, she developed a strategy, deliberate detachment. When instructors or classmates made dismissive remarks, she treated them not as personal attacks, but as data points, part of a system she was studying, one she planned to navigate and eventually shift. In 1931, alongside a small group of fellow Black aviation students who found themselves consistently denied flight hours at white-owned airfields, Janet co-founded the Challenger Air Pilots Association. This wasn't just a protest, it was a solution. They pooled their resources, purchased land in Robbins, Illinois, and began constructing their own airfield. It was no small feat. The members didn't contract professionals. They built it themselves, clearing land, laying down runways, and assembling makeshift hangars. Janet, drawing from her childhood experience with her father's building projects, took part in the physical labor. This wasn't symbolic. She knew that understanding an airfield from the ground up would serve her as both a pilot and a leader. The club's first plane was a used Taylor Cub, not glamorous, but reliable. Janet helped pay for it out of her nursing salary. This during the height of the Depression, when many families were struggling just to eat. When more aircraft were needed, she once again stepped forward financially. Her investment wasn't just monetary. She was staking her career, her identity, and her hopes on the belief that Black people could and should have their own place in the sky. Inside the Challenger Club, things weren't always smooth. While united by race and a love for flight, members came from different backgrounds. Some saw aviation as a hobby. Janet saw it as a career. As one of the few women, she had to navigate gender dynamics too. But rather than challenge the men directly, she earned respect through expertise. When engines malfunctioned, she stayed late with mechanics to learn how to fix them. That knowledge translated into influence. Soon, even the most experienced male pilots came to her for advice. Over time, the Challenger Club became more than a flying group. It became a cultural and professional hub for Chicago's Black middle class. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, and entrepreneurs came to Robbins Airport to witness something revolutionary: black pilots taking flight in their own airspace. Janet saw these gatherings as more than social events. She helped organize them, understanding their value for building networks and inspiring younger generations. What many miss in these stories is how professionally the club was run, thanks in no small part to Janet. She insisted on meticulous documentation, flight logs, maintenance schedules, expense reports. She understood that black organizations had to exceed industry standards to avoid being shut down under pretense. This administrative precision wasn't a side task. It was a shield against the scrutiny that often sabotaged black-led efforts. Robbins Airfield and the Challenger Air Pilots Association became case studies in self-reliance. Janet's role was foundational. She didn't just participate, she built systems. She showed how people excluded from the mainstream could create their own infrastructure and institutions without waiting for permission. In 1934, when Janet completed her first solo flight from Robbins, it wasn't just a personal milestone. It was proof that their collective vision was working. A tiny, handmade airfield carved out of prairie grass had become a launch pad for planes and for progress, and it had been built by those who were told they didn't belong in the skies at all. By 1937, Janet had accumulated far more flight hours than required for a commercial license. She was overqualified by both technical and experiential standards. Yet when she walked into the licensing office in Chicago to apply, everything changed. The examiner who greeted her had approved many white men before her, some with fewer hours, some with sloppier records. But suddenly, the rules became stricter. He avoided any overt reference to her race or gender, too risky legally. Instead, he began asking hyper-specific, advanced questions far beyond the standard examination. Janet wasn't surprised. She had seen this before. In her public health work, she had watched institutions bend the rules to keep people out without ever saying why. She responded with calm precision, answering every technical question. When that didn't work, the examiner turned to her flight logs, questioning whether hours logged at a black-owned airfield even counted. Janet responded not with anger, but with professionalism. She requested written documentation of exactly why she was being rejected. This put the examiner in a bind. He had to either fabricate a legitimate-sounding reason or reveal his bias in writing. The letter he gave her, vague and bureaucratic, became a quiet piece of evidence that would serve her well later. She didn't give up. She began researching where else she might apply for certification. Through her aviation network, she learned that different examiners and different regions applied the rules differently. Segregation wasn't consistent. It had cracks. And Janet, ever strategic, decided to exploit one of those cracks. She identified Tuskegee, Alabama, as a potential site. With the Tuskegee Institute's growing aviation program, the town had seen an uptick in black pilots and examiners willing to at least process their applications fairly. But it wasn't easy. Janet had to temporarily relocate, a financial and emotional strain. She left her job, rented a room, and focused entirely on preparing for a new examination. Upon her arrival in Tuskegee in 1939, Janet found a town steeped in transformation. The Tuskegee Institute, long a symbol of black advancement through education, had recently added an aviation program to its curriculum as part of the federal government's new civilian pilot training initiative. Though still limited, the program offered a glimpse into what was possible when the government allowed black institutions even a sliver of access to national resources. But Tuskegee wasn't a promised land. Janet was stepping into another male-dominated space, one where her race might no longer be the central issue, but her gender certainly was. The administrators and instructors, while generally supportive of black pilots, still harbored deep-seated assumptions about women's capabilities in aviation. When Janet asked to practice on the more advanced aircraft available through the program, she encountered subtle resistance. The barriers this time weren't hostile, they were patronizing. Some simply laughed, others gave her vague excuses. But once again, Janet adapted. She drew upon her nursing background. By emphasizing her medical knowledge, she framed herself. not just as a pilot, but as someone with valuable insights into aviation physiology. She offered to give informal talks on how the human body responds to altitude, G-forces, and oxygen deprivation. In doing so, she positioned herself as an asset, not a burden. Her efforts gained her both respect and access. She got the flight hours she needed. When the day of her flight examination finally came, Janet was prepared. Or so she thought. The examiner, a white representative from the Civil Aeronautics Authority, imposed an unexpected condition. She would be tested not in the aircraft she'd been practicing with, but in a completely different model. One with unfamiliar controls and handling quirks. This was not standard procedure. Male applicants had been allowed to test in familiar planes. Janet understood immediately that the move was intentional. It was yet another attempt to engineer her failure without making it explicitly about her identity. Still, she didn't protest. She adapted. Yet again, the flight test became a trial by fire. Every maneuver she performed had to be exact, every adjustment calculated. The examiner gave her increasingly complex tasks. Unusual turn patterns, non-standard landing sequences, rapid recovery drills. But Janet responded with professionalism, holding her composure even as she knew the deck was stacked against her. She completed a difficult landing, one she felt was satisfactory, even strong. But the examiner was unimpressed. He cited that one landing, calling it imperfect, and declared that she had failed. It wasn't just a rejection. It was a demonstration of how institutional power hides behind subjectivity, where the standards are unclear and inconsistently applied. Janet didn't fight the verdict in the moment. She didn't storm out or raise her voice. Instead, she asked the examiner for detailed feedback. Where exactly had she gone wrong? What should she do to improve? This tactic disarmed him. It also protected her reputation within the Tuskegee aviation community. By acting like a student seeking improvement rather than a victim of bias, she maintained her professionalism, and the community took note. This experience highlighted something deeper than personal struggle. It revealed how social change sometimes comes not through confrontation, but through quiet, persistent exposure. Every time Janet applied, tested, and endured rejection, she forced institutions to engage with her presence. She created a trail for others to follow, one hard-won inch at a time, and that kind of change required its own kind of bravery. Not the cinematic kind of storming barricades, but the daily kind. The kind that shows up again and again, even when the rules shift, even when no one cheers. When the United States entered World War II in 1941, it created a seismic shift in society. As young white men were drafted into combat roles, civilian industries, including aviation, faced staffing shortages. This opened doors that had previously been bolted shut. Programs like the Women Air Force Service Pilots, WASP, emerged, allowing women to contribute to the war effort by ferrying aircraft, training cadets, and performing non-combat duties. Janet, with her flight experience and technical skills, should have been an ideal candidate. But when she applied to the WASP program in 1942, she was rejected, not because of her qualifications, but because she was black. The rejection was not framed around race directly. Again, it came through coded language about fit and readiness. But everyone involved understood the truth. Despite challenging gender norms, the WASP program maintained strict racial exclusions throughout its existence. No black women were admitted. This contradiction, championing freedom abroad while denying it at home, was not lost on Janet. The government spoke of democracy and unity, yet held fast to segregation. For Janet, it was further proof that progress wouldn't be granted. It had to be taken strategically, persistently, and often indirectly. So once again, she pivoted. Instead of aviation combat work, she turned to aviation medicine, a growing field during the war. Pilots operating at higher altitudes were experiencing physiological effects that needed scientific study. Janet's dual background in medicine and aviation made her uniquely suited to contribute. She secured a position at Howard University Medical School, where researchers were studying pilot physiology under combat conditions. Effects like hypoxia, spatial disorientation, and G-force stress. Janet became a vital link between lab work and real-world flight experience. While this part of her career is rarely emphasized in biographies, it was foundational. Her work contributed to understanding how to equip and train pilots for extreme environments, research that benefited not just black aviators, but all aviators. Simultaneously, she stayed connected to the Challenger Air Pilots Association and Robbins Airfield in Chicago. With wartime fuel rationing limiting civilian flight, Janet leveraged her medical credentials to secure flight privileges. She framed her flying as professional development, linked to her aviation medicine work. She also developed informal networks to help other black aviators navigate segregated skies. She kept a private log of airfields, mechanics, and hotels that would serve black flyers, a kind of personal green book for aviation. This network became an invaluable resource during the war years, but perhaps the most important wartime development in Janet's career came in 1943. That was the year she finally earned her commercial pilot's license. The year 1943 marked a monumental victory in Janet Bragg's journey. After years of rejections, evasive examiners, and discriminatory roadblocks, she had finally achieved what no African-American woman before her had done. She earned a commercial pilot's license. But even this victory came with conditions that reflected the limitations of the time. The examiner who finally signed off on her certification was Harold Wallam. He later admitted that he had approached her test with heightened scrutiny. His wording was telling. Janet had not passed because the system had suddenly become just. She had passed because her performance had been so undeniably strong that the system could no longer justify excluding her. She had over-prepared for an exam she should have already passed, and in doing so, she left no room for dismissal. Yet this achievement didn't open the floodgates. Instead, Janet found that the very conditions that had created the opportunity, namely the war-induced pilot shortage, also restricted what came next. Civilian aviation was shrinking. Most airline activity had shifted toward military contracts, and commercial operations were minimal. Hiring was frozen, and what few positions existed were still blocked by race and gender barriers. Janet didn't wait for those doors to open. She built her own. With the limited commercial flying options available, she launched a small aerial photography business. Using her own aircraft, she offered services to real estate developers and construction firms, capturing aerial views of building sites for investors, insurance companies, and municipal planners. It wasn't glamorous, but it was strategic. It allowed her to accumulate flight hours and earn income on her own terms. Her entrepreneurial spirit during this period mirrored the same quiet resistance that had defined her earlier battles. She didn't challenge the exclusionary industry head-on. Instead, she carved a path that made room for herself and for those who would come after her. At the same time, Janet deepened her ties to the Tuskegee Aviation program. She became an informal advisor to the instructors and administrators, offering both medical insight and operational feedback. Her presence alone, an experienced certified black woman pilot, stood as a powerful counterpoint to the widespread assumption that black aviators lacked the skill or discipline for aviation careers. When the Tuskegee Airmen returned from their combat missions in Europe with decorated records, Janet made sure their accomplishments were recognized. She helped write and circulate stories, distribute press releases, and host events that showcased their success. She understood the value of visibility, especially in an era where black achievement was often erased or ignored. Back in Chicago, she returned regularly to Robbins Airfield, continuing to mentor younger members of the Challenger Club. Wartime fuel shortages made regular flying difficult, but Janet secured aviation gasoline under the pretext of professional medical research. Her persistence ensured that black pilots in Chicago stayed active, informed, and connected. She also began developing a new tool for resistance: knowledge infrastructure. She compiled lists of safe airfields for black pilots, kept notes on which flight schools were willing to work with black applicants, and documented her own experiences with bureaucratic discrimination. Over time, this informal archive became a vital survival manual for the few black pilots who dared to dream of careers in the sky. The war years for Janet were a paradox. On one hand, they offered her more visibility, responsibility, and freedom than ever before. On the other, they laid bare the unyielding persistence of exclusion, even during a national crisis. But she kept going. Her strategy remained consistent: adapt, anticipate, and organize. As the war ended in 1945 and service members returned to civilian life, the aviation industry shifted again. Many of the gains made by women and minorities during wartime were rolled back to make room for returning white male veterans. Janet saw the writing on the wall. Once more, she adapted. Rather than fight for space in an industry that had proven resistant to her, she began to build from the ground up. In 1946, she and several members of the Challenger Club established Bragg Air Service, a fixed base operation located at Robbins Airfield. The company offered aircraft maintenance, charter services, and flight instruction. This was more than just a business. It was an institution, a black-owned, black-operated aviation company that provided services to a clientele often overlooked by white-dominated operations. Janet and her team carved out a niche, serving Chicago's growing black middle class. Many of her clients were property developers or small business owners who needed aerial photos for inspections, promotions, or legal filings. She also trained mechanics and pilots, offering real skills in a real profession. Janet's business model reflected her strategic brilliance. Rather than compete directly with larger white-run operations, she focused on areas where her community was underserved. She created a space where black aviation wasn't the exception, it was the expectation. Bragg Air Service also became a training ground for young black aviation enthusiasts. Janet informally developed an apprenticeship system. Teenagers who were curious about flight or aircraft repair started by fueling planes, cleaning hangars, or organizing paperwork. Gradually, she introduced them to more advanced skills. A handful of them eventually became licensed pilots or certified mechanics. Her mentorship didn't come through lectures. It came through access, opportunity, and trust. At the same time, Janet expanded her property holdings. She began purchasing apartment buildings in Chicago's South Side, using them as a steady source of income and a base for building community power. In a city where black business owners often struggled to gain a foothold, Janet was quietly assembling a portfolio that gave her not just financial security, but political leverage. That leverage soon became necessary. In the late 1940s, developers began circling the land around Robbins Airfield. They saw it as prime real estate for new housing developments, and they wanted the airfield gone. Janet didn't wait for the pressure to build. She organized, working. With local business owners, church leaders, and community groups, she launched a campaign to preserve the airfield. She didn't just frame it as a business or recreational space. She called it an educational institution, a symbol of community pride and a critical training ground for black pilots. Her argument resonated. The coalition she built was strong, enough to delay zoning changes and block land sales. Robbins Airfield stayed intact, thanks in large part to Janet's organizing, advocacy, and insistence that black infrastructure was worth protecting. As the 1940s turned into the 1950s, Janet Bragg's influence began to stretch well beyond Chicago. Her work at Robbins Airfield, her leadership in the Challenger Air Pilots Association, and her strategic advocacy were gaining recognition among black aviation communities across the country. But instead of slowing down, Janet expanded her reach. She became an active member of the National Airmen's Association of America, NAAA, a group dedicated to promoting racial integration within commercial aviation and improving career access for black pilots. Most organizations at the time focused on legal battles or public demonstrations, but Janet's approach, consistent with her medical and aviation background, was methodical, evidence-driven, and solutions-focused. She compiled reports documenting patterns of exclusion in flight schools, pilot hiring, and military training programs. She built case files on individual instances of qualified black applicants being turned away. And when she met with airline executives or government officials, she didn't lead with emotion, she led with data. Her strategy was simple but powerful. Show that discriminatory practices were not only unjust, but also inefficient and short-sighted. By the late 1940s, major airlines had begun to consider token integration, the hiring of a small number of non-white pilots to signal progress. Janet saw this as a moment of opportunity and risk. She offered herself as a consultant, not for publicity, but to help companies understand what real integration looked like. She drew parallels between aviation and healthcare, noting that just as hospitals needed protocols and training to manage integration effectively, so did airlines. Behind the scenes, she worked to standardize hiring processes that were otherwise opaque and subjective. She advocated for anonymous application reviews and structured skills assessments, tools that would minimize bias and prioritize merit. While her proposals weren't always accepted immediately, they began to influence how airline HR departments approach diversity. Meanwhile, Janet was also earning new credentials herself. She secured both instrument and multi-engine ratings, qualifying her to operate in advanced flight conditions that few pilots of any race or gender had mastered. She traveled across the country, often to flight schools that had once rejected her to receive this training. Her presence alone at these institutions, as a confident, capable black woman, chipped away at the image of who a pilot could be. By 1950, Janet had created a remarkable professional life that combined healthcare, aviation, and real estate. Her income was diversified, her reputation was solid, and her community had come to rely on her not just as a pioneer, but as a builder of systems. What made her work in this period so extraordinary wasn't just her achievements, it was her vision. Janet understood that representation alone wasn't enough. For real change to last, it needed institutions, flight schools, airfields, businesses that could train, employ, and inspire the next generation. She had lived through decades of closed doors. Now, she was building doorways of her own. At Robins Airfield, she pushed for more formalized training programs. Veteran pilots mentored newcomers, mechanics held weekend workshops, and Janet began to organize open houses and flight demonstrations for school children, especially girls and black youth, so they could see aviation as a reachable dream. The culture of Robins evolved. It became not just a gathering place, but an incubator of black excellence in aviation. Janet made sure business skills were part of the curriculum too, helping young people learn how to keep books, file paperwork, and understand regulatory compliance. In her mind, flying was only one part of aviation success. Building sustainable careers required administrative fluency, financial planning, and strategic thinking. As the civil rights movement began to gather momentum in the 1950s, Janet found herself in an unusual position. She supported the goals of the movement wholeheartedly, but her methods, quiet, behind the scenes, institutional, stood in contrast to the emerging strategy of public protest and civil disobedience. Janet had spent decades pushing for change within systems. She knew how to speak the language of policy, procedure, and professionalism. She understood that not every battle could or should be fought in the streets. Some had to be won through paperwork, persistence, and quiet persuasion. When the Supreme Court issued its 1954 decision in Brown versus Board of Education, mandating desegregation in public schools, Janet recognized that this principle could and should apply to aviation training programs that received federal funding. She immediately began gathering evidence of discriminatory practices in these programs, focusing on flight schools that denied entry to qualified black applicants. Rather than launch a media campaign, she arranged private meetings with administrators at the Civil Aeronautics Authority and the newly restructured Federal Aviation Administration. Her argument was simple. Schools receiving public money had a legal obligation to provide equal access, and if they didn't, they were exposing themselves to lawsuits and losing out on qualified talent. The FAA listened, Quietly, they began revising internal policies. They introduced new reporting requirements, compelled schools to document admissions, decisions, and enforced non-discrimination clauses in funding agreements. None of these changes made national headlines, but they opened pathways for black students across the country. During this same period, Janet stayed connected to the Tuskegee aviation community, which was undergoing its own transformation. President Truman's 1948 executive order had officially desegregated the US military, and black pilots were now entering the Air Force in growing numbers, but many of them faced challenges, from implicit bias to isolation in largely white units. Janet responded by creating what might be described as an informal support network. She hosted dinners for young Air Force recruits, connected them with older veterans, and helped them prepare, mentally and emotionally, for the challenges they'd face. Her apartment in Chicago became a safe harbor, a place where black aviators could speak freely, ask hard questions, and receive wisdom from someone who had navigated these waters before. She also stayed in touch with policy leaders, writing letters to Congress, meeting with regulators, and continuing to advocate for reforms. Her tone never shifted into bitterness. Instead, she remained focused, respectful, and solutions-oriented. Her power came not from shouting, but from knowing exactly where the pressure points were. By the end of the 1950s, Janet had become more than a pioneer. She was a strategist, a mentor, an institution builder. Her fight wasn't just about flying. It was about forging a future where black excellence in aviation could thrive without apology. As the 1960s dawned, the civil rights movement surged into national consciousness, bringing new urgency, new faces, and a broader coalition demanding justice. For Janet Bragg, this era presented both opportunity and complexity. While she had long been working toward equality in aviation and beyond, the movement's shift toward direct action, public protest, and mass mobilization posed a contrast to the methods she had spent her life mastering. Younger activists sometimes questioned her quiet approach. Why wasn't she on the front lines of marches? Why did she continue to work within institutions that had tried so hard to keep her out? For Janet, these questions missed the point. She didn't see her work as separate from the movement. She saw it as foundational. In a 1963 speech delivered to the Negro Airmen International Convention, she laid out what she called a theory of specialized contribution. Not everyone, she argued, needed to protest in the streets. Some needed to infiltrate the systems. Others had to build new ones. Some had to document the progress so it could never be erased. Every movement required multiple tools, and hers was precision. Even as criticism lingered, Janet kept working. She expanded her mentorship efforts, this time focusing deliberately on young black women interested in aviation careers. These women faced a double burden: racial discrimination and gender bias. Janet offered them not just inspiration, but strategies. She taught them how to study for written tests, how to prepare for licensing interviews, and, most importantly, how to keep going when they were told no. In her Chicago apartment, she hosted small gatherings. The tone was informal, the advice exact. She helped young women understand how to respond to skepticism without losing their power. She showed them how to track their hours, how to document every interaction, and how to challenge rejections through administrative channels. Simultaneously, she worked with professional organizations to address gender equity in aviation. She pushed for female inclusion in pilot training programs, mechanics courses, and airline hiring pipelines. When asked to serve on advisory panels, she accepted, and then used her seat to reshape the conversation. She didn't just speak on behalf of women. She brought data. She brought letters from students who had been turned away. She brought receipts, and she was never afraid to challenge tokenism. When airlines began hiring a handful of black or female pilots to avoid criticism, Janet pointed out that inclusion without support was insufficient. She called for structured mentorship, career development, and equity audits, not just public announcements. Meanwhile, the broader civil rights movement reached a crescendo. The March on Washington in 1963 brought hundreds of thousands to the nation's capital. Janet attended, not as a protester, but as a representative. She carried with her folders full of documentation, statistics about aviation hiring, letters from rejected applicants, and notes from meetings she had attended. While crowds gathered at the Lincoln Memorial, Janet quietly delivered her packets to congressional offices. It was a typical move for her, working through official channels while the spotlight burned elsewhere. She wasn't interested in television, cameras. She was interested in regulatory change. When the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act followed in 1965, Janet celebrated, but cautiously. She knew that legislative victories, while historic, didn't guarantee enforcement. The systems she had fought her entire life didn't dismantle themselves overnight. They adapted. They shifted their language. And so, Janet adapted again. She began developing oversight systems. With help from legal advisors and allies in the aviation community, she compiled hiring statistics from major airlines. She compared pre- and post-Civil Rights Act numbers. She sent reports to the Department of Transportation and the FAA. Her approach was blunt but evidence-based. If the numbers weren't changing, the policies weren't working. Through these reports, she pressured airlines to adopt transparent hiring practices. Some resisted, others responded with small shifts, quietly expanding recruitment, introducing mentorship programs, and setting internal diversity targets. Janet kept pushing. She didn't expect perfection, she expected movement. In the midst of this work, she continued running Bragg Air Service and managing her real estate investments. These ventures provided not only financial independence but platforms for broader community engagement. When progress in one area stalled, she redirected her energy elsewhere. If she couldn't change an airline's policy, she could build a training program. If a school rejected a black applicant, she could help them prepare for the next application. If doors wouldn't open, she found windows. In many ways, Janet's greatest legacy during this time wasn't just her advocacy, it was the network she built. Dozens of young black pilots, male and female, benefited from her mentorship. They passed exams, landed jobs, and started businesses. And when they did, they turned around and mentored others. That ripple effect, quiet, personal, powerful, was Janet's true genius. Even as her public profile grew, she remained committed to the work over the recognition. She didn't give many speeches, she didn't write a memoir, but she kept every letter, every logbook, every receipt. She understood that legacy had to be preserved deliberately, or it risked being erased. By the late 1960s, Janet was widely known in aviation circles as a mentor, a trailblazer, and a force of nature. She had lived through nearly every phase of American aviation, from barnstorming to commercial airlines, from military training to civilian innovation. Her career didn't follow a single arc. It branched, adapted, and expanded, and through it all, she remained grounded in a simple belief that progress required both vision and infrastructure. Representation mattered, but institutions mattered more. As the decade closed, Janet began turning her attention to a new challenge: preservation. She knew that the stories of black pilots, mechanics, and airfield builders were being left out of official histories. She had lived those stories, and she was determined to make sure they didn't disappear. As the 1970s began, Janet Bragg turned more of her energy toward preserving the history she had helped shape. She understood that the stories of black aviators, especially women, were at risk of being lost, either to neglect or erasure. She had lived through decades of exclusion, and she knew that if she didn't act, future generations might never know how high people had flown against the odds. So she began an archival project of her own. Using the same meticulous habits, she had honed in nursing and aviation, record-keeping, filing, labeling. She began to collect everything: photographs, logbooks, flight records, correspondence, meeting minutes from the Challenger Air Pilots Association, even fuel receipts from her early days at Robbins Airfield. She tracked down her fellow pioneers, those still living, and interviewed them. She encouraged them to share their stories, to write down their memories, to donate their own documents. She didn't want anecdotal fragments. She wanted evidence, a full historical record, something permanent. In 1976, during the US bicentennial celebrations, Janet noticed a glaring omission. Across the country, exhibitions and publications celebrated 2 centuries of American achievement, but black aviators were nowhere to be found. Not in the museums, not in the parades, not in the textbooks. It was as if the skies had only ever been white. Rather than protest the omission publicly, Janet acted. She created her own exhibition, titled Black Wings. It featured photographs, documents, and artifacts from her growing collection. She designed the exhibition to tell a comprehensive story, not just of firsts, but of endurance, excellence, and contribution. She was determined that it wouldn't be confined to black institutions. She wanted mainstream aviation spaces to acknowledge this legacy. So she reached out to the Experimental Aircraft Association, EAA, organizers of the annual AirVenture gathering in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, one of the largest aviation events in the world. At first, the EAA declined. Politely, the event, they said, wasn't the right venue. But Janet didn't accept that answer. She reached out to several well-known white pilots she had met over the decades, people she had once mentored, advised, or simply impressed. She asked them for help, and they delivered. Their support helped pressure the EAA to reverse course. In 1977, Black Wings appeared at AirVenture. Thousands of attendees walked through the exhibit. Many had never seen images of black pilots from the 1930s and 40s. They had never heard of Robbins Airfield or the Challenger Club. They didn't know that a black woman had earned a commercial pilot's license in 1943. Janet personally led tours for journalists and aviation historians. She answered questions. She shared documents. She made sure the story landed. The exhibition sparked articles in major aviation publications. It inspired renewed interest in the history of black flight. But more importantly, it created a foundation. Over time, it would lead to broader efforts to integrate African American contributions into the mainstream story of aviation. Janet's role as a public speaker also expanded during this period. As women began entering aviation in greater numbers, institutions and event organizers began seeking out pioneering voices. Janet was invited to give keynotes, to sit on panels, and to be honored at banquets. Her speaking style wasn't theatrical. She didn't rely on slogans or dramatics. Instead, she was precise, laying out her experiences with the clarity of a historian and the insight of an engineer. She framed her personal journey within the wider context of civil rights, gender, dynamics, and institutional change. She emphasized the systems, how they worked, how they resisted, and how she learned to navigate them. Audiences appreciated her candor. She wasn't trying to inspire through abstraction. She was trying to equip people with knowledge. Her contributions didn't go unnoticed in the academic world either. Historians and researchers began seeking her out, hoping to understand aspects of aviation history that had been hidden or overlooked. Janet shared her records freely, photocopying articles, organizing interviews, and writing detailed letters. By the mid-1980s, Janet's apartment in Chicago had become something of a community archive. Former students dropped by to check in. Journalists visited to look at documents. Younger pilots came to ask questions. The walls were lined with framed photos, blueprints, and newspaper clippings. It was a museum without signs, a classroom without chalkboards. One of Janet's most meaningful roles during this period was as a mentor to black commercial airline pilots who had finally begun entering the industry in significant numbers. Many of them were hired during the 1970s and 1980s, often as part of delayed diversity initiatives. But they entered companies where they were still seen as novelties, and sometimes as intruders. They came to Janet for guidance. They found someone who understood not only the technical requirements of the job, but also the psychological weight of always having to be twice as good, twice as composed, and twice as prepared. She helped them navigate subtle bias and outright hostility. She offered perspective. She reminded them of how far they had come and how far they could go. Her apartment was more than a gathering place. It was a sanctuary. Pilots swapped stories, shared frustrations, and recharged. And Janet, ever the teacher, listened carefully before offering advice. In 1986, the Federal Aviation Administration finally recognized Janet Bragg with its prestigious Pioneer Award. The ceremony brought together old friends and new admirers, aviation officials, military veterans, civilian pilots, and students. For many, it was the first time they had heard Janet's full story. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Some of the same institutions that had once denied her were now honoring her. But Janet accepted the award without bitterness. In her speech, she didn't dwell on past injustices. Instead, she used the moment to highlight what remained undone. She shared current statistics about airline diversity, pointing out how few black women still held pilot licenses. She talked about mentorship, about infrastructure, about policy. She reminded the audience that progress wasn't automatic. It had to be protected, nurtured, and advanced. Her closing words were simple. The sky hasn't changed, but now more of us know how to fly. By the late 1980s, Janet Bragg had become an enduring figure, not just in aviation history, but in the broader story of American perseverance. She had survived every kind of exclusion, economic, racial, gendered, and responded to each barrier with strategy, calm, and resolve. But even as honors and tributes began to arrive more regularly, she stayed focused on what mattered most, preserving truth and empowering others. As she entered her 90s, Janet knew time was no longer something she could take for granted. She had decades worth of archives, photographs, letters, engineering notes, press clippings, and she needed to decide where they would live after her passing. She didn't wait for institutions to come to her. She reached out herself, evaluating museums, libraries, and universities based on how they treated access and community engagement. She ultimately split her collection between two places: the Smithsonian, National Air and Space Museum, and the Atlanta University Center Archives. Her reasoning was deliberate. The Smithsonian would ensure national visibility. Atlanta would ensure that her legacy remained embedded in the institutions built to uplift black scholarship. Both institutions welcomed the materials with enthusiasm. Curators and archivists expressed admiration not only for the documents, but for the organization of her records. Each photograph was labeled, each letter dated, each event cross-referenced with pilot logs or receipts. It wasn't just a donation, it was a blueprint of a movement. Janet insisted that her archives remain accessible, not just to scholars, but to students, hobbyists, and aspiring pilots. She believed that history should not be locked behind gates, that people should be able to see firsthand how someone like her had done it. In these final years, she also gave a few rare interviews. Her tone was measured. She avoided romanticizing her story. When asked about the discrimination she faced, she didn't dwell on the injustice. Instead, she emphasized the tactics, the planning, the preparation, the importance of staying focused even when the rules weren't fair. She wanted young people to understand that history wasn't made by heroes. It was made by people who showed up, kept showing up, and refused to let the system exhaust them. Progress, she once said, isn't magic, it's maintenance. Though her physical mobility declined in her later years, her mind remained sharp. She corresponded regularly with younger aviators, sending typed letters full of encouragement and advice. She continued to track FAA policy changes and occasionally submitted formal feedback. Her hands may have left the yoke, but she never left, the cockpit of the movement she helped build. She also continued investing in community projects. She donated to local scholarship funds, paid tuition for students pursuing engineering degrees, and even funded repairs at Robbins Airfield when it faced a series of budget shortfalls. She never wanted the field to become a relic. It had to function. It had to fly. Janet passed away in 1993 at the age of 86. Her death was mourned across multiple communities: aviation, nursing, civil rights, and business. Obituaries appeared in both national papers and local newsletters. Some celebrated her as the first black woman to earn a commercial pilot's license. Others recalled her work with the Tuskegee Airmen, her founding of Bragg Air Service, or her pivotal role in aviation medicine. But the most accurate descriptions came from those she mentored. They spoke of her quiet strength, her discipline, her unshakable belief that black excellence wasn't an exception. It was a rule, if only given the space to breathe. After her passing, efforts to memorialize her accelerated. A scholarship was established in her name for aspiring black female aviators. Aviation museums added her story to their permanent collections. A section of Robins Airfield was renamed in her honor, and young pilots, many of whom had never met her, began citing her as a role model. Her legacy expanded through ripple effects. Pilots she mentored went on to lead flight schools, establish training programs, and even fly for NASA. Mechanics, who trained under her, built aviation tech companies. Her insistence on documentation, mentorship, and community reinvestment had built an infrastructure that kept generating excellence long after her final flight. Her philosophy, strategy over spectacle, systems over slogans, found renewed relevance in modern times. As new waves of activists looked for models of sustainable change, Janet's life provided answers. Not the kind that fit neatly on posters, but the kind that built resilient communities. One of the clearest signs of her lasting influence came in the 2000s, when aerospace researchers began citing her work in aviation medicine. Her insights, once shared in informal talks and tucked away in notes, were now seen as precursors to formal pilot health protocols. Oxygen efficiency, hypoxia detection, G-force training, areas where Janet's early observations had helped inform modern safety. At the Smithsonian, visitors viewing her donated collection are often struck by how complete her story feels. There are photos of her hauling aircraft parts, letters she wrote to regulators, checklists scrawled in pencil, and in one exhibit, a quiet but powerful image. Janet standing beside the first Taylor Cub she helped purchase for the Challenger Club, smiling, not triumphantly, but confidently, a woman who understood exactly what she had built. At a memorial ceremony held several years after her death, one former student summarized her legacy best. She didn't just take flight, she made flight possible for the rest of us. That's what Janet Bragg left behind. Not just a record of personal achievement, but an entire ecosystem of empowerment. An understanding that progress is more than milestones. It's mentorship, investment, documentation, and determination. It's building a runway where there wasn't one, and helping others take off from it. And so, when we speak of American pioneers, when we list the names that shaped our skies and stretched the boundaries of possibility, Janet Bragg belongs in that conversation. Not as an exception, but as a cornerstone. Janet Bragg's passing didn't mark the end of her story. In many ways, it launched a new chapter, one shaped by the way her legacy was kept alive, shared, and expanded upon. In aviation hangars, classrooms, and museums, her influence took root, not just as a historical figure, but as a framework for how to create sustainable progress in the face of systemic barriers. In the decades following her death, aviation historians increasingly integrated her story into the broader narrative of American flight. She began to appear in textbooks, in lectures, and in exhibits that had previously focused only on men, or only on white pilots. Still, it took persistent effort from educators and advocates to ensure that Janet's name wasn't just a footnote, but a chapter in its own right. In 2005, a full documentary was released, detailing the formation and impact of the Challenger Air Pilots Association. Janet featured prominently, not only for her technical and financial contributions, but for the quiet leadership she demonstrated in every phase of its development. Viewers were struck by her foresight, by the practical, organized way she went, about solving problems others hadn't even noticed yet. One segment of the documentary focused on a set of maintenance logs she had kept for the club's first Taylor Cub. Each repair, each modification, was recorded with care. The film's narrator noted that Janet's attention to detail didn't just help her fly, It helped the organization endure. Her paper trail told a story of professionalism in a world that had tried to label her a hobbyist. Meanwhile, the archives she had so carefully assembled continued to bear fruit. At the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, researchers began digitizing her materials, creating online access points for teachers, students, and independent learners. High-resolution scans of her pilot logbooks, letters to the FAA, and even notes from her early aviation medicine presentations were now available around the world. In the classroom, educators used Janet's life as a model for integrated learning. Her career intersected multiple disciplines: STEM, history, civics, public health. Teachers designed units that paired her aviation journey with discussions on the civil rights movement, or compared her experiences in medicine to those of women in science during the same era. Young girls, especially black girls, began discovering Janet not as a mythical pioneer, but as someone real, tangible, and human. Someone who struggled, pivoted, documented, and prevailed. School projects, science, fair posters, and scholarship essays started referencing her. Her name became more than a historical marker. It became motivation. And in aviation circles, her influence only deepened. Black women pilots, a group that had once been barely visible, began citing Janet as a guiding light. Organizations such as Sisters of the Skies and the Bessie Coleman Foundation included her story in their orientation materials and mentorship programs. At Robbins Airfield, now maintained by a private foundation dedicated to its preservation, a bronze plaque was erected in her honor. It stood beside the hangar where Janet had once worked late into the night, repairing engine valves, inspecting our gearboxes, and helping new members understand flight dynamics. The inscription read, "Janet Bragg, pilot, builder, visionary. She taught us to fly when the world tried to keep us grounded." The site became a modest pilgrimage destination. Young pilots flew in from around the country just to stand on the runway she once cleared by hand. Some left letters, others brought students. A few even staged commemorative flyovers, tracing circles in the air above the field where Janet had taken her first solo flight decades earlier. Perhaps most poignantly, Janet's emphasis on systems building, on infrastructure, began to influence not just how people honored her, but how they organized their own lives. More flight schools began offering targeted scholarships for underrepresented students. Community programs modeled after Bragg Air Service started sprouting in cities like Atlanta, Detroit, and Baltimore. Each one referenced Janet, not out of nostalgia, but as a model that still worked. Meanwhile, the FAA introduced a new annual award for contributions to aviation diversity. In 2010, they renamed it the Bragg Award for Aviation Inclusion. At its first ceremony, under the new name, a young black woman pilot, just certified with her first commercial license, accepted the honor. In her speech, she said, "Janet Bragg didn't just break barriers, she built new systems in their place. Today, I fly because she refused to stop when they told her she couldn't." Even in space, Janet's name made an appearance. When a satellite designed for atmospheric research was launched in 2016 by a team of students from historically black colleges and universities, they named it Project Bragg. The satellite, modest in size, carried sensors to measure flight path, turbulence, honoring Janet's dual contributions to aviation and aviation medicine. In interviews surrounding the launch, one student said, "We named it after someone who understood that flight isn't just about lifting off. It's about knowing the air, respecting the machine, and planning for every obstacle." That clarity of vision, both scientific and philosophical, had become the hallmark of Janet's legacy. In popular culture too, her story gained traction. A stage play dramatizing her life premiered in Chicago in 2018, focusing on her early struggles at the Aeronautical University and the founding of Robbins Airfield. The production earned critical acclaim for its intimate portrayal of a woman balancing ambition, frustration, and resilience in an unforgiving world. Critics praised the writing for showing Janet not just as a symbol, but as a person, someone who cracked jokes, suffered defeats, and questioned herself, but never stopped trying. That year, dozens of Chicago public schools added the play to their curriculum. A local theater company even hosted workshops where students could write monologues inspired by Janet's inner thoughts, what she might have whispered to herself before a test flight, or how she might have felt when her first application was denied. For many students, the connection was immediate. Janet wasn't just a name from the past. She was a person who had walked through their neighborhoods, stared down the same kinds of doubt, and still charted her own path. And that, perhaps, was the greatest legacy of all. Janet Bragg didn't live her life to be remembered. She lived it to make things work, better, stronger, fairer, for those who would follow. But in doing so, she became unforgettable. As we close this story tonight, it's important to understand that Janet Bragg's legacy isn't just preserved in monuments or museums. It lives in the systems she built, the people she mentored, the doors she forced open, and the mindset she left behind. A belief that change isn't spontaneous. It's structured, it's documented, it's earned through repetition, resilience, and resolve. In today's aviation industry, black pilots are still underrepresented, and women, especially black women, even more so. But the path that exists, however narrow or winding, is one Janet helped forge with deliberate effort. She didn't just break through barriers. She asked, once through, how can I leave this open for someone else? That question became a compass for her entire life, and it remains a compass for those who follow her. Her approach was never to wait for permission. She understood early on that inclusion would never be granted out of goodwill. It had to be demanded with clarity, backed by credentials and sustained by community. Janet proved that when you combine talent with relentless structure, you can bend even the most rigid systems. Even in her absence, her strategies endure. Pilots today prepare for flight exams using checklists modeled after the logbooks Janet kept. Aviation diversity programs echo her emphasis on mentorship and incremental progress, and educators teaching students about STEM, civil rights, or women's history increasingly point to Janet Bragg, not just as a pioneer, but as a blueprint. At aviation symposiums, her name is now invoked alongside legends, not as a novelty, not as an exception, but as a standard bearer. The Black Wings exhibit she launched in the 1970s has since evolved into a permanent digital archive, visited by thousands of researchers, students, and curious travelers each year. Her original materials, typed letters, hand-drawn flight schematics, maintenance reports, remain among the most requested pieces in the Smithsonian's Air and Space Research Division. And yet, for all the official honors and formal recognition, it is in quieter places that Janet's influence is most profound. A small flight school in Alabama runs a scholarship in her name. Every year, one young woman is chosen, not just for aptitude, but for grit. The winner gets flight hours, ground, school tuition, and one-on-one mentoring. On the first day of training, they're given a copy of Janet's biography, not as inspiration, but as instruction. This is how it's done. In Chicago, an after-school program for middle school girls offers hands-on exposure to aviation and engineering. The kids design paper gliders, learn to read altimeters, and even simulate landings on old flight trainers. The room is filled with photos: Amelia Earhart, Bessie Coleman, and always Janet Bragg, smiling next to her plane, sleeves rolled up. And then there's the next generation of pilots, women of color who walk into hangars or cockpits and are no longer the first, maybe the only, but not the first. They carry Janet's story in their muscle memory, in their study habits, in their unwillingness to walk away just because the room wasn't built for them. They know what Janet knew. It's not enough to get in. You have to hold the door open. As night falls and this story winds to a close, let her name echo like a call sign. Janet Bragg. The architect of her own runway, the strategist who mapped resistance, the builder of a sky big enough for everyone. She didn't ask for attention. She asked for accuracy. She didn't chase applause. She documented the truth. And tonight, that truth flies. Still, through every pilot who soars with quiet strength, and every student who believes they belong in the sky, not by invitation, but by right. So rest easy tonight, my friends, knowing that history remembers not just those who break records, but those who break silence. Not just those who take flight, but those who make flight possible. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with wide skies and steady wings.